Right. Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Ennis. I'm the Director of Public Engagement here at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. We are thrilled to have you joining today to learn more about what the Department of Treasury released yesterday regarding implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. Today we are joined by three speakers. First, the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy for Clean Energy Innovation and Implementation, Christina Costa. And then from the Department of Treasury, Deputy Tax Legislative Counsel, Shelley Leonard, and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy, Tom West. With that, I will turn it over to you, Christina.
Thanks so much, Jess. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all very, very much for joining us. 6 weeks ago, as you know, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law. It is the single most ambitious legislation in American history to accelerate building the clean energy economy and to tackle the climate crisis. We are working expeditiously across the federal government to implement this landmark law and to make sure that families, businesses, and communities across this country start seeing benefits as soon as possible. About 2/3, a little more than 2/3 really, of the law's provisions will be implemented through the tax. So yesterday, as an important step in the implementation process, the Department of Treasury issued 6 notices requesting comment from stakeholders, experts, and the public on key climate and clean energy tax incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act. These notices are sort of like requests for information. They're an opportunity for stakeholders, experts, and the public at large to provide insight and recommendations to Treasury as they formulate the rules that will govern how all of these tax incentives work. The notices ask for feedback on important questions, like how can customers shopping for a used electric vehicle determine whether it's eligible to receive a tax credit? Do we have the right tools in place to know that clean energy projects like solar and wind projects can qualify for enhanced support when they use American-made materials? And how can we make sure that the credit enhancements in the law create good jobs by incentivizing developers to pay prevailing wages and to utilize registered apprenticeship programs? Now, we know that many stakeholders who will want to weigh in on these important provisions don't necessarily have a lot of experience interacting with Treasury processes as opposed to processes elsewhere in the federal government, which is why we arranged this briefing today for all of you. So you can get a laydown from our Treasury colleagues about what these notices are, how the comments submitted will be used, and next steps on implementation. So I'll turn things over to the real experts here, Tom West and Shelley Leonard from the Office of Tax Policy to walk all of us through that. Tom and Shelley, over to you.
Thanks so much, Christina, and thank you all again for joining us today. I have to say, as a longtime tax lawyer and tax policy person, I'm unaccustomed to this much interest in the work that I do, but I am buoyed and energized by the fact that we have so much interest in the work that we're doing here. We're certainly excited to be working on the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. As you know, Christina said it, the IRA is one of the most significant legislative investments in clean energy and addressing climate change in our nation's history. It's not only a giant step forward on the climate agenda, but it'll get us there while we're saving money for families, we're creating new good-paying jobs, and we're shoring up our energy security. The initial estimates on the Inflation Reduction Act have $270 billion of the $369 billion in investments being delivered through tax incentives. That means Treasury, where I work, and our colleagues at IRS Council, at IRS, who we work closely with, are front and center, and we're tasked with some of the heavy lifting on the implementation here. It doesn't mean that this isn't kind of a whole of government process. We're already working very closely with all of our interagency colleagues, leveraging expertise across the administration. But a lot of the laboring will happen in the IRS, along with help from our colleagues. So this is a challenge for us, but it is one that we are really eager and excited to take on to be a part of it. So what we're hoping to do today is familiarize you all with our processes and procedures and talk about how you and other stakeholders can be involved and helpful in the process. So I'll tell you that we are accustomed at Treasury Office of Tax Policy and at IRS, we are accustomed to challenging implementation in the tax state. But the nature of the IRA and the novel non-tax aspects of it present different challenges, and it naturally invites scrutiny from from stakeholders and different groups who aren't typically involved in the tax process. So I think it's particularly important that we have conversations like this to kind of explain our process and also demystify it a little bit. So I think I'm going to talk through today some of the specific aspects of IRA implementation and some of the early efforts that we are making. And I'm going to talk about some things that may be a bit different about IRA, where we're going kind of above and beyond what we usually do in the tax process. But then my colleague Shelley Leonard is going to give a rundown of the more typical process, where and how public engagement is involved there, or where public involvement is important in the regular process, which will come during IRA, but we're kind of in an initial stage here where we're doing more. And I wanted to talk about some of the notices we were putting out. If we could go to the next slide. Sorry. Well, let me keep going. So yesterday, there you go. Yesterday, Treasury and the IRS issued a series of notices that Christina flagged in. They're covering a lot of the waterfront on IRA, on the different climate and clean energy provisions in the IRA, at least those that are, going into effect in the next year or so. There are obviously some provisions in the IRA that are longer term. It's not that we're not thinking about them, but these notices are really designed for to get us started on some of the difficult questions that we are grappling with right now. We don't always put out notices like this or request public comment at the beginning of a tax rulemaking process or at the beginning of a tax guidance process, but it's putting these out, I think, is a recognition of what I said about some of the non-tax equities here and some of the non-tax expertise that we know we are going to need to leverage. So, and it also speaks just to the fundamental importance of the IRA, frankly. These notices request comments from the public and from stakeholders within the next 30 days. How are we going to use the comments and the input we get? Is kind of the next natural question. Well, we are currently working on guidance. The IRA statute lays out broadly, the rules broadly, but lots of those rules need to be filled in. And we fill in those rules in our role at the Office of Tax Policy and IRS, either by regulations or by sub-regulatory guidance. And so when I refer to guidance, I'm saying we're working on different kinds of guidance right now, and these comments will inform that guidance. Some of the guidance that we're looking to get out will be out by the end of this year. And there's some rules and some guidance that we're working on that's a bit longer term than that you might not see until at some point next year. But one aspect of the questions that we've asked here and the comments we've requested is the prioritization of the guidance I'm talking about. So we know there are things that the public needs to know by January 1st of next year. And so to the extent we're asking questions about things that you have an interest in or you want to comment on, telling us, well, this is something that we really need to know about by the time these rules go into effect on January 1st, 2023. That's the kind of ways we are going to use the comments that we get. If we could go to the next slide. I think the notices are really an example of the guiding principles that we are using collectively, both Treasury and our colleagues across the administration, on implementation of the IRA. The first principle you see here is robust and broad public engagement, operational legislation, and it in fact demands input from as wide a spectrum of stakeholders as possible. There are obviously some very tax-specific rules or tax-centric rules that require specific expertise, but that's the kind of expertise we already have kind of in-house, where we know how to leverage. That's the kind of people we always get comments from. What we need here are, and what we in the administration are hoping is that to hear from a broad spectrum of people. We want to hear from the people who don't always engage with tax guidance. Whether that's, labor unions or community organizers or climate policy thinkers who, don't know anything about tax. They are still going to be really important in terms of informing where our guidance goes and how we implement this legislation. The next guiding principle is clarity and certainty. Clarity and certainty are critical in implementation of the IRA. Again, this is sweeping legislation that has really far-reaching goals, and we're not going to reach those goals. We're not going to get the results that we're hoping for. We're not going to spur uptake of these tax incentives if we can't communicate clearly and provide guidance that translates to the average person. Not all of the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act are, necessarily individual level or, consumer credits, but many of them are. And, Christina set it up at the beginning, the kinds of questions we're asking. What we want to do is make clear to people how to access the intended benefits here, whether it's for a new electric vehicle or a more energy efficient appliance. We need to tell people how they personally can benefit, and we need to give them answers on what the rules are about how they claim the benefits. In terms of the bigger credits, some of the business credits associated with large-scale development of clean energy, the same also holds true. It's important that we provide clear rules so that we can incentivize those projects to get started, to start putting shovels in the ground as soon as possible, to start creating the jobs that we'd like to see created. So the need for clarity and certainty here is also of a piece with the first point about engagement. The comments that we ask for and the input that we are seeking can help us determine what issues or questions the public most urgently needs us to answer, right? That's the clarity and certainty here. What questions do you all have? If you're looking at a specific provision in the IRA and saying, I think I could benefit from that, but I'm not sure about a certain aspect of it. Those are the kinds of things that we need to work on in the guidance to provide clarity and certainty. Same thing on the development side, on the larger scale development side. What questions are holding a developer back or an investor back from making an investment in a utility scale project? Well, we need to know if there are impediments or things that we can answer up front that will help those projects get started, that will then translate into jobs and translate into reduced carbon emission. The final principle guiding our implementation is what we call sound stewardship. Treasury and the IRS have a lot of experience implementing tax provisions that require protections against fraud and against abuse. But I think in this context, in addition to that, what I think is most important is for us to balance the desire for uptake of these incentives with guardrails that ensure that benefits are flowing to the intended uses and beneficiaries, whether that means, communities designated as energy communities or the laborers who are going to be building out our more secure energy future. We want to make sure that the rules that we put in place are protecting those equities. So I think I'm going to quickly flip through the next two slides and say, there's lots of information in this deck about the notices that we issued. I've already touched on them. If you go, in fact, to the next slide, it lists the notices and the specific topics within those notices and where you can find them. I would encourage anybody who's interested to take a look at those. It will tell you there's a lot of dry tax boilerplate up front that is always required in the kind of in our kind of process. But you'll quickly scan those and you'll flip to the questions that we're asking. And I think people can home in on the things that are of interest to them. And I would tell you, we're very much listening in this process. So that is kind of IRA specific, IRA centric. going to hand it to my colleague Shelley Leonard, who can talk a little bit more about what kind of comes after that and how we typically go about doing tax rulemaking, which does involve even more input from the public, but in a more kind of organized fashion. So Shelley.
Thanks so much, Tom. Appreciate that. Can you hop to slide 8? There we go. So question 1, what do Treasury and IRS do when we are implementing tax law changes, such as what's in the Inflation Reduction Act and any tax law? So as Tom mentioned, we work hand in hand with IRS, and there are a number of different types of guidance that we might issue. We use the generic term guidance as the umbrella term for all of them, but they're listed here on the slide. I would say from most resource and time intensive on our part to least resource and time intensive. First thing are full-blown Treasury regulations. They go through a full notice and comment process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that process on the next slide. Then slightly less resource intensive are notices, revenue procedures, revenue rulings, and announcements. We call this sub-regulatory guidance creatively, or IRB guidance, because it's published in the Internal Revenue Bulletin. And the notices we just put out yesterday fall in this bucket. Sometimes they're asking questions like we just did, but they're also used for substantive rules. Then we have IRS forms, instructions, and publications. You're probably familiar with those. Doing your personal income taxes, Form 1040, instructions, worksheets, things that go along with that. So the IRS puts out volumes of those every year for all different types of tax provisions. And then finally, we have things like FAQs, fact sheets, website postings on irs.gov or treasury.gov or cleanenergy.gov. And that's where you'll find more of the plain English, plain language, explainer type resources. And I think that might be where a lot of our audience goes to get this information. So we plan to use all of these types of guidance in implementing the Inflation Reduction Act provisions. They all serve a purpose, and depending on what the issue is and the context, different types of guidance are appropriate for different issues. But for some of the biggest and most significant questions, we'll be using regulations. And so the process for that involves first gathering a lot of information, doing some legal analysis, and putting out what's called a proposed rule or a notice of proposed rulemaking, proposed regulation. And so that lays out sort of a first draft of regulatory text that Treasury and IRS are considering publishing in final form. But then there's an opportunity for public comment at that point, usually between 30 and 90 days, where people can submit written comments on the proposed regulation. They can also request to be heard at a public hearing. You want to give oral testimony. And then Treasury and IRS go through a process of reading all of these comments, synthesizing them, and then publishing the final regulation. And that final regulation will respond in writing to each of the comments received, as well as provide amended regulatory text. So that is a big process. And the notices that we just issued are they are in fact an earlier opportunity for public comment than the public comment period that we will also have with all the proposed regulations. So it's sort of a first bite at the apple. I think this is really crucial, especially because some of these provisions are so novel to the tax space that we need to get input just to inform putting out the proposed rule. And we think that will be so valuable. Really looking forward to as much engagement there as possible, so that we can then embark on the regulatory process. The comments we receive right now will also inform sub-regulatory guidance, which does not go through the notice and comment. So that helps make sure we're getting the sub-regulatory guidance informed by as much public input as possible. I'll go to the next slide. And so we're getting a lot of questions on timing. We cannot project specific timelines for different pieces of guidance at this point, but for regulations, the process really depends on the complexity of the provision, how many comments we get, and all the number of definitions, guardrails, different things that need to be provided as a reference point in enacting other major pieces of tax legislation, such as the Affordable Care Act or Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It can take between 18 and 36 months from when the law is enacted to when we have a final regulation published. But taxpayers do not need to wait until when that final regulation is published to know how to comply with the law. Often proposed regulations will say that they offer reliance, which means that taxpayers can rely on those proposed rules, comply with those. The IRS would not challenge a position taken in accordance with the proposed regulations. We also can offer interim rules in sub-regulatory guidance before a final regulation is published, and that can help taxpayers know what to do before the whole regulatory process has run its course. On certain key issues, we do expect to have guidance out in the coming months. We're very mindful of the fact that a number of these provisions go into effect next year, and so we'll be working to prioritize those issues that have the most urgent need for clarity and certainty for taxpayers. Go to the next slide. So as far as the role for stakeholders and the public and interested people in these provisions, what we ask is that you provide written comments in response to the notices. Each of the notices contain instructions for how to do that. They can be submitted electronically at regulations.gov. Please note that these are publicly available, so anything that you put in a comment that's submitted that way will be posted for anybody to find. And you can also mail in comment letters, and they would be posted as well. And detailed written comments that are constructive, that are thorough, will be the easiest for us to utilize and turn into constructive feedback for the guidance. So we appreciate all the thought and time and effort that goes into these letters, and we expend the same amount of thought and time and effort reading and considering and analyzing the comments. We're also taking individual meetings for people that request those. We just ask that a description of the issues to be discussed are provided in advance. So I think we'll go to the last slide at this point. If you want more information, the IRS does have a useful primer up on its website about IRS guidance. And then there are links to each of the notices where you can find the specific questions asked. And you're not limited to answering those specific questions either. Any general input on the provisions is welcome. So we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much.
And I would just note as well that links to all of the notices are also available on cleanenergy.gov in case you don't have a pen to write down these longer URLs.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining, and we will talk to you later. Look forward to seeing your comments. Bye.